The work I'm going to share with you today is an important one that stands humbly on the shoulders of one of psychology's often forgotten giants, Erich Neumann, and his little-known seminal work outlining the psychological dynamics of why we war. Depth psychology and a new ethic is that simple and that iconic a piece of work. His groundbreaking three-part psychological analysis of this was repression, suppression, and projection. In this video, I will be explaining and expanding upon that sequence as outlined in the book, and what I understand to be the fourth evolution of it that would include emotional processing, or what I call the processing function, which every evolved family member really must shepherd their children through and develop within them if they would like to spare them a lifetime of unnecessary suffering, conflict, and illness. That said, this is all just the intellectual scaffolding, and as many of you will know, the installation process itself is somatic and energetic. My hope is that in the coming years, we will begin to include the fundamentals of this work in forward-thinking schools around the world who understand only too well that the healing and development of consciousness itself should finally have its rightful place in education, right alongside reading, writing, and arithmetic. With that being said, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoy. In a work of remarkable genius entitled Depth Psychology and a New Ethic, Erich Neumann, one of Carl Jung's greatest students alongside Mary Louise von Franz and others, was really the first to formally identify the entirely natural and yet psychopathological process by which we as humans have historically dealt with our traumas. What he discovered was that we first repress them, then we suppress them, and then finally, once the capacity of the psyche has been completely exhausted, we project them onto others, and primarily, but not limited to, those we love the most. Neumann coined this sequence that we are all still engaged in to this day, the old ethic. What I hope to offer in this presentation is an expansion of his work and an elaboration of precisely what the new ethic is, what Neumann, in fact, mentions really only briefly as a confrontation with and integration of the shadow, and which I would like to propose also involves, more specifically, the installation of a fourth evolution to the old ethics, repression, suppression, and projection sequence that we might call the processing function. This is a psycho-emotional and somatic process or habit that we would have to develop and train like any other skill. It's one that I've now installed with myself, in partnership with my wife, with countless clients over the years, and now with my children, who interestingly were able to learn this by the age of 9, which has long since led me to believe that the sooner we teach young people how a healthy psyche functions and what they need to do to shepherd that healthy functioning, the sooner they will learn. But for now, that's for another presentation. For now, I'd like to just begin by placing this old ethics sequence in the larger cultural context in which we find ourselves at the end of the first quarter of the 21st century, by pointing out that since Neumann made his discovery almost a century ago, the old ethic as a psychological process within the personal and collective psyche has actually metastasized into a monolithic, multimedia, socio-cultural, and institutional matrix that we all now suffer from, and that I sometimes like to call the mainstream industrial distraction machine. Now, as many of us will know, the agenda of the mainstream industrial distraction machine is to mesmerize our attention, to hold it captive, estranged from our bodies, our psyches, and most importantly, our traumas, as quickly as it can and for as long as it can, which very rapidly develops into an addictive reliance upon it, and which in turn perpetuates its existence and exacerbation. What is perhaps less well known, and what I hope to demonstrate, is that all this directly perpetuates every variation of offensive conflict in the known world, almost without exception, from domestic disputes to school shootings to multi-state kinetic war and everything in between. So with that lighthearted introduction, let's begin. Of all the disturbing elements of the mainstream industrial distraction machine, there exists three that are arguably the most devastating for human flourishing. Number one, the implicit censorship of interiority, right, including all notions of self or higher self. Number two, the explicit creation of false idols, and I say that in a non-denominational way, in place of this absent interiority, which only serves to misdirect us and our awareness perpetually and catastrophically away from ourselves. And finally, three, the denial of trauma, including the intellectual understanding of it and the embodied ability to process it, which could also be included in all forms of suffering. All of which has the net effect of propagating all variations of offensive conflict without exception, and which in turn strengthens the very need for the mainstream industrial distraction machine to exist, thereby creating, as we've already kind of intimated, a self-serving, self-perpetuating, infinite vicious cycle that only an acknowledgement of interiority and the ability to process the traumatic contents within it, otherwise known as a transition from the old ethic into the new via the installation of a processing function, can resolve. This, I would argue, and at this stage of human history, is really our most pressing need, to learn how to methodically and systematically process our pain so that we can undermine our ongoing collective addiction to repressing, suppressing, and then projecting that pain outwards onto others, and specifically those we love the most. And in so doing, perpetuate the endless horrors of the conflict-soaked, chaotic world. So let's take each of these items one at a time. The censorship of the self. The mainstream to this day continues to implicitly discourage the development of interiority, by which we mean a focus on the emotional, energetic, depth psychological, and spiritual aspects of the personal psyche, all of which creates a vacuum, literally a vacuum within the body-mind that our awareness itself should inhabit, that we should be drawn into, but that instead is filled with a myriad of Hydra-like, and now mostly digital, false idols in its place, just content in its place, while simultaneously wrenching our very awareness that should be anchored there into an outer world of hyper-consumeristic, profit-maximizing distractions, we all know this, that are not simply sold to us, but actually we are forcibly coerced into subverting our very lives to attain. And the result of this amounts to nothing less than an automatic, at this point, highly efficient induction into a life of consumeristic subservience, slavery, that promises us the world while thieving it from us in the process. Now, in Western folklore, this transaction has a name, the Faustian bargain, right? It's the original deal that we make with the devil for a life in which we don't have to face our pain, in exchange for nothing less than our souls. However, do not be misled into believing that this is merely a quaint tale of magical realism, right? That has been explained to us in parables, and mythology the world over. It is in in truth, the actual deal we make with the mainstream world when we allow the maw of consumerism to devour us. The consumeristic world in this drama plays the role of the Dark One, the devil, Mephistopheles, who encourages us to trade the precious time we would otherwise use to develop that interiority and process the pain within it for a life of painless, dissociated distractions. Now, as a result of both this implicit prohibition of interiority and the creation of attractive, shiny, false idols in its place, we are powerfully and understandably disincentivized from acknowledging the most painful elements of that interiority, our traumas, and from developing even the most rudimentary skills required to process them. You can see where we're going here. We're going towards the processing function. On the contrary, the mainstream is forever honing its attention-captivating apparatus to perpetually reroute our awareness into precisely the opposite direction required for well-being and healing, telling us to never look inside, never face our pain, never seek out and look deeply into the eyes of our unconscious guilt and shame, but to instead externalize and project all that back onto the world. And in the process, set the very foundations in place. And at this point, continue them, perpetuate them for all forms of conflict that have now been going on since, the endlessly looping blood feuds of the very earliest tribes. And I would like to repeat this point so that people can maybe appreciate, the emphasis that at least I would like to place on this particular, dynamical and diabolical feature of the sequence. Because of the very nature of the mainstream distraction machine to endlessly mesmerize and externalize our attention and awareness, literally prying it from our inner world, our bodies, our emotions, our traumas, it serves to arrest, and as quickly as possible, what would otherwise be a natural endogenous ability that would naturally develop to metabolize and process our pain, which then leaves our psyche with no other recourse than to repress, suppress, and project it outwards in an endlessly doomed to failure, mutually assured destruction conclusion. This is arguably the mainstream's greatest toxic byproduct, writ large. Beyond ecocide and teen suicide and the splintering of our collective attention to a million pieces and the augmentation of lies and debasing of all truth and a million other noxious byproducts that are also part of this, it is nonetheless this censorship of interiority as an assault on the very substrate of our own psychosomatic and spiritual development that legions of diabolical engineers and marketers are forever conspiring to redirect us outwards instead of inwards and away from, and that perpetuates nothing less than mankind's greatest scourge and, it should be said, distraction from the pain within, war. Now, to understand exactly how this happens requires us to return gratefully to Neumann's great work, Depth Psychology and a New Ethic. Now, he was the first to discover in this work the psychological process in which unconscious trauma, emotional pain, unbeknownst to the individual or indeed the collective, is self-righteously projected onto a scapegoat as an unconscious means of discharging the burden of that trauma from the individual projecting. Neumann identified this as the repression suppression projection sequence, and the primary way that human beings, families, tribes have dealt with the phenomenon of psycho-emotional pain since the beginning of time. He should have won the Nobel Peace Prize for it, but okay, that's another rant. What this all means is that if you are not actively and conscientiously engaged in a process of metabolizing your pain, your trauma, on at least a monthly, if not weekly basis, which you would know if you were, then you will be engaged, I'm sorry to say, no offense, you will be engaged in the old ethics sequence in your life, without question. You will be repressing and suppressing and projecting your pain onto others, none of which has anything to do with offering constructive criticism or seeking out corruption and outright malevolence in the world and attempting to eradicate it. All of that can be done and regularly is done with projection or without projection. And that's the difference. As an aside, the government should probably offer us tax rebates for those who exhibit the ability to do this work of processing their trauma and undermining their projection function, because it might as well be considered the very foundation of community service itself, because doing so has such a positively impactful and widely distributed effect on a community's social fabric, psychological well-being, healthcare costs, and overall prosperity. But that's another aside. Let's take a moment to elaborate Neumann's old ethic in detail, starting with the first part of the sequence so we can really understand it, the repression function. So, your psyche's capacity to contain trauma is finite and needs to be periodically evacuated. And by trauma, I would also include not just the emotional fallout of acute bodily trauma, but also more broadly, psycho-emotional trauma generated in the family unit, in relationships, and as a natural consequence of just living life, which, as we all know, comes with it existential dread, death anxiety, loneliness, and the fear of simply surviving, subsisting, keeping our heads above water in a cruel, hyper-competitive, increasingly toxic world. All this energetic, traumatic content builds up in the body almost at once, in the womb, and from our very early stages. And it's dealt with by the psyche with a repression function that involuntarily, automatically, right alongside the autonomic nervous system, it literally shunts this material directly into the unconscious, bypassing the conscious ego, the conscious mind, because we as yet do not have the faculties to process it. Now, to be clear, were it not for our ability to repress, like global mental health would be unimaginably worse than it currently is. While the term repression has had a historically bad reputation, it really remains a highly valued function of the human psyche because it holds at bay what we are as yet unable to face about ourselves, those around us, and the world in which we live. In fact, for most of human history, repression has been our only psycho-emotional, you could say, immune function that we've had to the disturbing content inherent in life itself. Without this function actively working and supporting us, we would likely all be dribbling, shivering, shell-shocked basket cases, just lurching from one moment to the next in a subjective, boundaryless swirl of agony. And perhaps our most ancient ancestors were for a time, until that first great psychic wall between the conscious and the unconscious mind was dropped, forged, birthed, and the repression function began its grand work of siphoning material too disturbing for the conscious mind to bear directly into the unconscious. Almost like cryogenically freezing someone suffering from an illness that present-day medicine cannot heal, and storing them safely and securely, in this case in the unconscious, until a future time when the ability to heal it is finally known. Now, in modern therapeutic parlance, these disassociated, frozen parts of us, we could say, are often called exiled parts or exiled inner children, and that it is our responsibility as healers and healees to, over the course of our lifetime, reanimate and reintegrate, which is perhaps the most fundamental aspect of the soul's journey in life. It's the natural evolutionary impulse towards ever greater wholeness, right? For more about that, you can check out my video, The Collective Unconscious and the Journey of Soul. The repression function, however, is not as secure as cryogenic stasis. And even over a short period of time, that which is repressed begins inevitably to seep out, right? Giving rise to all manner of unconscious, maladaptive behavioral compensations that includes overeating, overworking, overdrinking, drug taking, and of course, an addiction to the screens of the industrial distraction machine. All of these defensive adaptations to pain, right, strive to support the repression function, right, by holding all that pain down, keeping it at bay in the unconscious indefinitely, as if this temporary stopgap solution was designed to last forever. But of course, it's not. And at some point, even we ourselves begin to realize that we are leaking pain in all manner of ways, all over ourselves and those closest to us, with passive-aggressive barbs, excessive judgments, violence, self-harm. The list is endless. You know many of them. At which point, the second of the two foundational defensive mechanisms against disturbing psychic content is engaged to support the failing repression function, right? Neumann called this second mechanism, this second, chain in the sequence, suppression, the suppression function. So, our traumas want to make themselves known to us in periodic situational repetitions, the repetition compulsion, and of course, emotional eruptions. Now, this begins to take place more forcibly when the involuntary and unconscious repression function begins to fail, at which point we ourselves are required to engage that second stage, a process of conscious suppression, which characterizes the difference between the two functions. With repression, the process of shunting traumatic content into the unconscious is involuntary, takes place without our conscious awareness. With suppression, we are aware of our pain, though we may not be aware of all of it, and we may certainly not understand, and usually don't understand, where it's coming from or its origins, but we are accordingly required to actively hold it down solely with the power of our will, right? Through all manner, once again, of psycho-spiritual activity that includes meditation, breathwork, exercise, and any practice that supports the holding down of this traumatic content, which can be very maladaptive once again, because once again, it's attempting to emerge. That being said, it's precisely for these reasons that the suppression function has been arguably the greatest tool of the great religions, right? They have elevated the suppression function, right? Something that we're doing consciously, actively, willfully, to a kind of high art, whether it's the monastics in Europe who continue to take vows of abstinence to this day, to the sadhus in India who stand on one leg for the eternity of a life. These are all variations on the theme of becoming what in Neumann's day was described as a man or woman of self-control, right? The idea being that you could have absolute mastery over the body, which of course we now know is not only impossible in the long term, but unadvisable and completely counter to the healing process and, impulse towards wholeness. And yet, for the entirety of human history, following the failure of the repression function, which once again takes place automatically, we've had no choice but to engage in the suppression function until that too breaks down. Because like the psyche's ability to hold trauma down with repression, our ability to willfully hold down trauma with suppression is limited and invariably fails as well. Now, at this point, the third and final sequence in the old ethic is triggered, in which the psyche, in an ongoing attempt to avoid a complete psycho-emotional meltdown due to the ever-increasing buildup of traumatic contents within it, generated once again simply by living life, it begins to surreptitiously discharge quantities of that traumatic content that it can no longer bear onto someone else, whether a partner, child, opposing political party, or neighboring sovereign state via what we call projection. So let's talk about the projection function. At this point, allow me to offer you an analogy. Imagine that you are the caregiver of the large, stately home of your body-mind, but you have no means of washing dishes or doing laundry or taking out the garbage. And since the creation of this magnificent residence, you've had no choice but to store all this increasingly toxic material, the dirty dishes, the soiled laundry, the garbage, in your basement of your unconscious, and in ways that are unbelievably labor and resource intensive, and that you know full well deep down are not sustainable. But without any other recourse, with no means, no understanding of how to wash or cleanse these items, you have no choice but to persist in what is no less than a psychosomatic Ponzi scheme with a single, unsuspecting client, yourself. And for years, until the day the basement of your unconscious reaches its full capacity. And you have no choice but to begin transferring that toxic material into the living room, the kitchen, the garden, the bedroom, and most disturbingly, onto those closest to you. This is the activation of the projection function and the psyche's self-serving and also, it should be said, self-preserving solution to a repression and suppression function that have both begun to fail. Projection is simply another temporary stopgap contingency plan to a problem that the psyche has still yet to develop a sustainable solution to resolve, but that also crosses a red line for the very first time. Because this is the first of the functions in the sequence that transgresses upon another, and in turn creates the initial conditions for conflict and ultimately war. Now, the projection function, it should also be noted, is paired with a secondary function that defends our own personal ego consciousness from being aware that we're doing projection at all, that we're actually secretly dumping our own energetic waste onto someone else. This corresponding function is one of the most sophisticated psychological sleights of hand that exists in the depth psychological domain, and is called, as some of you will know, rationalization. So let's talk about the rationalization function. So now the individual in question is not only projecting their pain onto another, but rationalizing that displacement, critique, or attack as legitimate, while simultaneously repressing the knowledge that any trauma whatsoever is also being projected onto them, and that on the contrary, a valid objection, vital personal crusade, or public service is likely being courageously undertaken. However, and this is something of a subtle nuance, even when the target of the projection is overwhelmingly deserving of critique or attack, if it is excessively violent or disproportionate in any way to the original offense, it will remain a self-serving act by which the psyche is once again unconsciously unburdening itself of traumatic content that it has no other way of evacuating, let alone processing, other than by projecting. In this way, we could say that the projection function is like a kind of Trojan horse that unconscious trauma hides within and then is sent secretly to infiltrate a target for the purpose of relieving the psychic system that's projecting of the pressures of that trauma, unbeknown usually to both projector and projectee. To this end, what we can say about the mandate of the projection function is that it is a survival mechanism of the psyche itself, whose capacity to repress and suppress has been exhausted and whose ability to process has yet to be developed. And so in a way, and I'm not an apologist for this process whatsoever, but in a way, it has to project. We have to project as human beings. We're impelled to project, compelled to project. And in so doing, sadly, perpetuate conflict is the only means of relieving those intra-psychic pressures of trauma within us by externalizing them before a complete psychic breakdown takes place. Another way to put it is this: conflict and war are highly primitive survival mechanisms of a psyche. I mean, counterproductive, highly primitive, counterproductive survival mechanisms of a psyche that has yet to develop the ability to process trauma. Let me say that again. I feel like I butchered that one. Another way to put this is conflict and war are highly primitive survival mechanisms of a psyche, counterproductive survival mechanisms of a psyche that has yet to develop the ability to process its own pain. Which means that if you are engaging in offensive conflict or in disproportionately aggressive responses to conflict, then you're very likely engaging in the projection function as a self-serving means of evacuating your own unconscious trauma. And that only has the net effect of perpetuating more of it. In this way, the old ethic is an endlessly destructive cycle in which trauma via conflict is forever transferred from the powerful to the weak, from the weak to the powerful, in the couple, in the family, from parents to children, from children to parents, from superpowers to lesser powers, from one faction of the collective to another, and back again, in a never-ending passing of the hot potato trauma game, which will never be resolved because, like our ecosystem, the psyche's ability to hold pain is finite, and we have already long exceeded it, and yet which also has evolutionarily given rise to this new fourth function in the sequence that characterizes our first instantiated psychic step in the direction of a new ethic that Neumann originally proposed in that fourth function that is already called emotional processing, but that I would call the processing function. So installing of the processing function arguably first began consciously and systematically with the Freudians and Jungians at the beginning of the 20th century, who developed the talking cure and from it psychoanalysis. Since then, it has been adopted primarily by the sensitives in the family, the empaths, the overgivers, and yes, the scapegoats, who have historically always taken on the lion's share of trauma within a family and community, and who in Neumann's time were unflatteringly called neurotics, if you can believe it, but whom Neumann also hailed, this is the important part, he also hailed them as the avant-garde members of society. Quote, "The sensitive, psychically disturbed, and creative people," he said, "are always the forerunners. Their enhanced permeability by the contents of the collective unconscious makes them receptive to emerging new contents of which the collective is not yet aware. These are also the people for whom problems become insistent in their personal lives 100 years or more before the collective has woken up to their existence." So, big tip of the hat to the empaths out there. These are the individuals who have worked hand in glove with practitioners to this day, my own precious, hallowed, beloved clients included, and with whom we are all, as a healing community, profoundly indebted, and of course are constantly working with to continue to develop an increasingly robust and consistently reliable processing function. So how do we install the processing function? Well, firstly, we should acknowledge that we are now faced with the dual necessity of supporting adults and children to install the processing function, both of whom require entirely different approaches. For adults, we are retroactively installing the processing function into an existing psyche while simultaneously deinstalling, to the degree that we can, all the maladaptive compensations that were needed to make up for the lack of it, which include the repression, suppression, and projection functions. With children, on the other hand, we have the amazing opportunity to install the processing function at the ground level, and in so doing, bypass the inevitable over-reliance on the old ethic that most adults, naturally depend upon, and that nonetheless will still exist and continue to take place involuntarily when the child's psyche, its capacity to contain trauma is exceeded, right? However, before we begin with a practical illustration of how to install the processing function with adults and children, I would like to offer a brief explanation of what we are actually doing at the somatic depth psychological level when we make this transition from projecting to processing. And this is really important. It took me a long time to kind of find the words for this very tactile, energetic process that's taking place. To put it simply, the projection function, right, the pathological process of projecting onto someone else, is an unhealthy transgression upon the other. Whereas the processing function, the healthy emotional processing function, is a healthy transpiercing of the unconscious. And specifically, those unconscious firewalls that protect us from accessing those suppressed and repressed traumas directly. When we project, we are unconsciously exorcising our pain. We're distancing ourselves from it. When we process it, we are consciously connecting to it, excavating it, healing it. Another way to put it is that the projection function scapegoats the other, while the processing function sacrifices the self. Remembering, of course, that the meaning of to sacrifice means to make sacred, to make holy, to make whole. We could also say that when we take responsibility for our suffering, when we are worthy of our suffering, as Dostoevsky might say, we are sacrificing ourselves over the other. This has been incredibly important for me to support families, specifically fathers. I have said to fathers many times, fathers who are angry, or mothers who are angry, you must sacrifice yourself for your child, for your partner. Instead of projecting on them, carry your own cross. That is the beginning of pulling that energy back inwards, transpiercing the unconscious, accessing the trauma directly, and beginning to actually do the grieving and cathartic process that's required for processing. It is a sacrifice, but it's one hell of a noble one. So allow me to paint the picture of how we would begin to do this with a child as young as 7. It's the end of a school day, and the child has arrived home angry, passive-aggressive, snarky, and disrespectful. Every parent knows the scene. This will always be the first iteration of the repression, suppression, projection function in action, and which most parents will unconsciously encourage because in various ways they're doing it themselves. However, when we see this, we must strive to offer the child 2 options and 1 prohibition. It's really a 3-step process in that regard. We prohibit them from projecting onto anyone else in the family. And this includes a rude word and even an eye roll as you get good to it. The better you get at it, the more rigorous you are, energetically hygienic you are. So what we do is we offer them either the ability to take space, right, and self-regulate, or to begin to process that pain with us by co-regulating, right? which would involve them expressing it vulnerably, right, as opposed to projecting it. Now, initially, the child will take space because they will be unable to express their pain vulnerably because the processing function has yet to be installed. Like the vernacular has yet to be installed. The behavioral patterns, like none of it's there. But over time, with consistent, kind, loving invitations to learn how to co-regulate together and not simply take space, even though both skills will be important for the child to develop, self-regulation and co-regulation. We want it all. What will happen is that the child will linger on the frontier of the co-regulatory space, right? And this will be a lingering that happened, during potty training, before they were walking. It's a frontier. It's a rite of passage. It's just one that we haven't really amplified and placed on the pedestal with other rites of passage, but it may be one of the most important. The child will linger on the frontier of the co-regulatory space, teetering between anger and vulnerability, between projecting, which they will probably have already learned just from being in school, and processing, which they will not even understand yet. This is to be expected. And it's also to be expected that they will have a kind of immune response to processing, right? They will be more drawn to projecting, which would be like that original, ancient, counterintuitive, counterproductive, primitive immune response of the psyche that's trying to get this pain out of them, right? And of course, sometimes they will just have to get it out and you have to let them. You, as a good parent, you have to feel these moments out somatically, right? It's not an intellectual color by number process. But their automatic, ancient, nervous system will be trying to exorcise this and place it onto someone else, right? It will be trying to relieve their system, their psychic system, of the excessive emotional burden that it can no longer bear. Now, above all, this is the moment where the alliance between the mother and father will be most essential, because any kind of disequilibrium between them may be exploited by the projection function of the child, right? In the case of single parents working alone, the entire burden of holding the boundary for the child will rest on your shoulders and will be more challenging at times, but it's still entirely possible to usher through successfully and with practice. But ideally, parents would be working shoulder to shoulder on this. Okay. At this point, this is, once again, usually the moment in which the child's projection function is going to increase in intensity, right? Sensing that it might be thwarted, right? That the parent and the family is not going to continue their own little blood feud where everyone projects on top of each other, right? We're interrupting that. Now, sensing that might be thwarted, right? The child might increase in intensity, at which point the parent must be aware that there are two options that most of culture falls into in this particular instance. Ideally, we would neither cave into and take their abuse in an oftentimes overly liberal, excessively accommodating approach, nor follow, on the other side, the more traditional, we could say conservative approach in which a boundary is kind of too firmly held and oftentimes disproportionately aggressively or dissociatively, which will simply repress the child's anger even more deeply and produce an even greater projection eruption at some later point in the future. So once again, the two ways that we usually fail in this is that if we're a little bit more accommodating, we'll simply take it in the face and perpetuate projection. If we're excessively rejecting, we will perpetuate deeper repression, which will then result in greater future projection eruptions. On the other hand, if the parents can close in with love, I should say close ranks with love, gently but firmly, and prevent the child's projection function from erupting outwards, right? Without, of course, like gauging as we're doing this, the child's capacity, right? You don't do this to a 2-year-old who's crying, right? Like obviously, right? There's a certain capacity. There's a moment when the parent realizes that the child is being enabled and being, is really has started to like run this projection pattern too much. Like you can feel it as a parent. This is the moment where, as a parent, you close ranks And you are holding space for that energetic impulse that wants to externalize, right? And hold the boundary to it. And invite them to take responsibility for what is theirs, right? So instead of it erupting outwards, if you're holding a loving, compassionate, kind container, that energy will have no other choice but to slowly begin to kind of transpierce inward into the unconscious grief. And they will go from the classic pattern from anger into grief. And in so doing, make contact with it, which is the energetic redirection required to install the processing function. By gently refusing to allow the child's anger to cross the boundary of someone else and thereby escalating the conflict, the energy has no choice but to redirect itself through that unconscious psychic boundary into the suppressed and repressed traumatic material within. When this happens, the child will transition from anger to grief, from projecting to processing, from conflict to catharsis. And yes, they will cry. At this point, the parents must resist the temptation to high five and shout, "Gotcha, you little brat," and immediately support them, right, with tenderness and appreciation as the processing function begins to undergo its initial preliminary installation, we could say. Now, naturally, this must be done gradually, repeatedly, and to the tolerance and ever-increasing capacity of the child. We must never force the process, but train it slowly and with patience to the tolerance and capacity of the child. Now, when you're able to usher this process through to completion, you will find that the child will cry for 5 to 10 minutes, depending on the intensity of the situation, and of course, skillful means of the parents, which will then be followed by a startling degree of relief on the part of the child. I mean, they'll be doing cartwheels 15 minutes later, half an hour later, right? As a result of that energetic trauma burden that has now been relieved from their psychic system by a healthy, increasingly conscious, cathartic processing function. In my own personal experience as a parent and as a clinician, this remains the primary practice for ushering children into an adoption of the new ethic from the get-go, alongside, of course, modeling that very process to them ourselves in real time. So in a potential part 2 of this presentation, I'll offer another overview of how this installation of the processing function can take place with adults. Although, as I'm saying all this, I kind of feel like if you're an adult and you're doing this work, you could probably get it just from this. And so, that being said, I'll offer a short conclusion. We are in the time of transitions, as we all know. In every major domain and institution that exists, we're in lockstep, I believe, with the natural evolutionary changes occurring within the human psyche. They're all taking place together. We have been told that we are made in God's image, and if that's the case, then it's clear that we've also made the world in ours. What an archetypal and depth psychological orientation to life reveals is that everything around us, our homes, our family dynamics, our careers, our very culture at large, is simply a series of remarkably accurate, ever-expanding, nested renderings of our internal psychic state, personally and collectively. And to make this a little more clear and not so general, I'll give you an example. Take the rear view mirror. The rear view mirror in your car, we could say, is an externalized intrapsychic artifact of the projection function. Just as the car is an externalized intrapsychic artifact among many of the psyche itself. Like the projection function, the rear view mirror shows us what is behind us, what is already in our past. But it does so situationally and paradoxically in front of us, in our present. Now, can you imagine if no one had ever taught us anything about the rear view mirror, about the psyche of the car and its functioning? And for the first few decades of our lives, we were required to navigate through life looking out through the windshield in front of us without ever being aware that in this small, discrete section in the very middle, we were actually being presented with images from behind us, from our past. It's a fascinating correlate, I find. Because if that was the case, the rear view mirror would have become exactly what the projection function currently still is: a colossal unconscious confusion, a great and confounding unknown unknown that continues to have disastrous conflictual consequences to this day. Similarly, and this is probably for another presentation, but I'll touch upon it here briefly, I would propose that our global energy transition from fossil fuels into renewables is also a kind of macroeconomic reflection of the very same transition taking place within the human psyche today, from the unsustainable old ethic of repression, suppression, and projection that remains extractive, exploitative, highly contaminative, and non-renewable, into the new ethic of the processing function that is not just renewable, but restorative, increasingly equitable, and best of all, freely bioavailable. You don't have to hurt anyone else to do it. When we have no processing function, we as individuals and as a collective are nothing more than emotional volcanoes that have no choice but to periodically erupt. And because we cannot do this in polite society without immediately pathologizing and incriminating ourselves, we have developed the projection and rationalization functions to disguise our eruptions within seemingly legitimate criticisms and protests and even all-out assaults, which are then often counterattacked with disproportionate responses from the other side that also betray yet further projection and surreptitious acts of trauma unburdening. And on it goes into the clustered deluge of the world that we have today. Until we begin to recognize all this and teach it to our young people who are newly arrived in the world, and as always with young people, with hopes and dreams of making it better, but with only an old ethic to work with, we will continue to experience an endless cycle of zero-sum, no-win conflicts with every successive generation. Thank you for listening.